That's an enviable position for any first time author. Take viewers back to the point in time, if you would, when you were essentially really first sitting down to begin working on the book together and how it creatively bloomed from there.
Initially, we hadn't even conceived of it as a novel. We thought we were going to write a series of satirical essays. And the first time that we met to work together, we decided we'd start with the interview. And that was the first real conversation we'd ever had about the job. And Emma shared with me her recollections and her impressions, and I had my recollections and my impressions. And the thing that really surprised us just in that first hour was that they matched. And that was our first inkling that not only were my experiences similar enough that this subject was really worthy of attention, but the fact that our experiences were really interchangeable. It's like, oh, it's not just one crazy lady. This is a whole group of crazy ladies. This is a whole community. And the way we decided to create that first chapter was we outlined, the order of events, and then we alternated. So she would do the arrival, I would do the talk in the living room, she would do the tour of the apartment. Over the course of that week, she emailed me her sections. I just slotted them in order. I didn't do any editing or retouching, and you couldn't tell who wrote what. And without any editing, that is the prologue that exists today. We never touched it. And I dare you to figure out where her voice ends and mine begins.
Amazing. Let's take fans back to the creation of the memorable cast of characters from this book, which of course star Nanny Schuster, the Harvard hottie, Mr. and Mrs. X, and Baby Grayer X.
Once we had that prologue, we started to think about who this family would be if we were going to just tell it through one family. Of course, none of the families we worked for were that interesting. We certainly were parts of very large staffs. We certainly had inklings about affairs, but for the most part, it was just heartbreaking, right? The work of that book was making it funny and not just a miserable slog of, the despair of 4-year-olds. So the first thing we had to figure out was the child. And we actually made Greer a boy for pronouns because we realized if we had Nanny and Mrs. X and Greer in the room at the same time and the 4-year-old was a girl, it would just become impossible. So we had a boy for that very reason. And then we loved kids. So Greer came to fruition quite quickly. Emma was really the one who wrote Greer. She channeled him. She had an inkling. She just had a deep sense of him, a deep felt sense. And I was Mrs. X, for better or worse. We both wrote all the characters because we would write alternating scenes. However, I would rewrite Mrs. X's dialogue and she would rewrite Greer's dialogue to get it where it needed to be. I don't know what it says about me that if you stopped me right now and said, what did she just have for lunch? I'm like, I can tell you. I just knew that woman in my bones. But they weren't one family that we worked for. They really were what the book needed them to be. And the reason we called them the X's was because we'd met in a great books program. My father is a rare book dealer. My mother was a librarian. I grew up in a family where books were the religion. They were how we communicated with each other. We had a constant book club going. Books were everything. Stories were everything. So Emma's father is a college professor. So we wanted to make it seem like it was a real family. And that's why we called them the X's. We were sort of following in that Dickensian, Victorian, satirical tradition through the 1900s. And so to us, it was a very clever literary device, but people took it very literally. And they really thought that we actually had worked for that one family and that this was really our diary. Our first agent suggested to us that we should have a boyfriend in the building. And we thought that was the most absurd thing that we had ever heard because there was no boyfriend in the building. There was no interest. There was no flirtation. There weren't cell phones. Can we explain what this job was? It was just you and the kid and Play-Doh for 8 hours. But we started to think about it. And I had grown up in New York City. I actually grew up on Park Avenue and I knew those New York City boys. And Emma had been here since she'd arrived to go to NYU. And we were really fascinated by the dance of who boys like Greer become. And we also were very interested structurally in counterpoints. which is why we created the character of Grandma, who is nothing like either of our grandmothers. But we wanted to show a wealthy person who was enjoying their life, who was using their money for good. So that's why we created Grandma. See, we made choices as writers. And then we thought, well, it would actually be interesting to have a boy in the building from the kind of family that I had grown up alongside. You know, the moms covered in golden retriever hair, the parents who were really hands-on, even if the fathers worked in banking. You know, that kind of family really existed in New York in the 80s and early 90s, and then it disappeared. And so that's what HH represented, but then it allowed us to have his friends to show sort of the future for the boys who have childhoods more similar to Greer's.